Welcome. Today we are going to talk about Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Actually, the "of" kind of goes on and on, as there's a large host of people who all want to lay claim to Anselm and his brilliance and his import for philosophy, theology, etc., as Catholics identify him as one of the doctors of the Church. Anselm is one of those, once again, pivotal figures. As you noticed, we will be addressing a lot of pivotal figures. That's kind of what elevates them to the point of being called great thinkers. And Anselm's main pivot was that he is known for the birth of dialectic, as kind of being the first to reintroduce or introduce dialectic into philosophy. Now, we know this isn't starting with Anselm. In fact, it started a millennia before him easily with Socrates, right? But and we also have examples of dialectic existing in the East as much as it does in the West. At the end of the semester, we get to people like St. Photios and his use of dialectic, including Aristotelian dialectic and dialogue, is well before we have arguments from Anselm here. But the idea of dialectic is there's a sort of informed question and answer response. I'm going to try to advance a philosophical concept by asking you a question, and maybe you'll get a chance to answer it, or maybe not. Maybe I'm kind of introducing the idea and the counter idea, and then what the actual conclusion is going to be. And Anselm really does a fantastic job doing this, even though he learned it from Lanfranc, his teacher, and others. He's usually seen as the man who really kind of gives it life, especially in the West. Anselm, sometimes referred to as Anselm of Acosta, or Anselm of Bec, or finally Anselm of Canterbury, lived from 1033 to 1109. But Italy, France, and England all lay claim on Anselm because he's that important in shaping doctrine and philosophy in the West in the Middle Ages. 1033 to 1109, we're just starting to have this sort of shift, especially in the West after the first millennium. We're living right on that edge of when the Great Schism between the churches of the East and West are in 1054. Anselm's right there, young adult in the middle of all that, where theologically you start to just have this as a manifest split. Philosophically, arguments are harder to move back and forth between East and West. Constantinople is not terribly far from Italy, and yet ideas become a little bit harder to transmit this way. Anselm exists kind of on this bubble. He's getting some work through some sort of the monasteries. We're seeing the rise in power and controversies amongst the papacy and fights with different emperors. So again, he's in this interesting historical moment. Born in Italy, he'll end up moving eventually to England. It's really interesting to look at his life. As a young man, as a little boy in Italy, he would look up at some of the mountains and think that God lived on top of these mountains and in the Alps, right, in the northern part there, and think, okay, on the top of those, in those cloud-covered mountains, that must be where God resides, and I kind of want to be up there. And a little bit older, he even kind of still had this idea in his mind, and he wanted to go off and be a monk in the Alps. He tried it, actually, but his father said, no, that's not happening. You're not going to be a monk in the Alps, and he's going to forbid it. So instead, what does he do as a fairly well-connected person, having enough money for the luxury of doing other things? He backpacked through France, trying to find himself, essentially. Wandered around France, kind of looking into different mindsets, etc. But you kind of have the whole I'm going to go backpacking through Europe sort of thought, and this is kind of what Anselm was doing as well. This is where he encountered Lanfranc and will end up joining the Abbey of Bec, much to the dismay of his father, or it would have been. He was ordained a priest at the age of 27, and so at this point, Anselm is now a priest. When the founder of the Bec monastery died, Abbot Herluin, he became the next abbot in February of 1079. When Lanfranc died, he was made the next bishop of Canterbury, December of 1093. And so this becomes his next sort of spot. It's actually Christmas Day that he's kind of put up into that. Anselm is also known when he is archbishop, or actually right before becoming the archbishop, for his engagement with the battles for who would become the pope and how all of that should look. He's finally consecrated archbishop on December 4th of 1093. The anti-pope, right, you get the title given to those people who are popes but elected by some group, not recognized as the other. Usually it's pope and anti-pope, and who ends up being deemed the actual pope and who's actually the anti-pope is a sort of question for many as well, but that becomes kind of engaged here, right? So the anti-pope Clement was disputing the authority of Urban II, who was recognized by France and Normandy. You might know Pope Urban II for his call for the Crusades. He's the one who did that famously. William II of England, commonly referred to as Rufus, didn't really care which of the two was Pope, but he really wanted to kind of say, I'm the one who gets to, choose. I want to be able to say this guy is the Pope or not. When Anselm asked to leave to go to the Pope, the king said that no one in England should acknowledge either Pope until he got to decide on the matter. A little bit of hubris of nobility there, and we got to have this sort of fight. Anselm insisted on going to Pope Urban II, whose authority he had already acknowledged, and then he told the king, this is it, and if you want me to be the bishop, you're going to accept this guy as the Pope. And that was kind of it. That's the way it went. So Rufus didn't get to decide. Anselm just kind of told him, and that was that. In many ways, Anselm was a radical bishop. Throughout this era, really the 100 years before and the next like 300 years afterwards, we see this fight between supremacy of who's in charge. Should it be the secular powers or the religious powers? And who gets to decide on appointing bishops in lands? Is it the Pope or is it the king? And this varies from locale to locale. France, it's usually more the king. In places like Germany, it's usually the Pope. And then we have some places where there's a battle back and forth. Sometimes the clergy would fight against secular or civil authorities, sometimes not. And it's this 400, 500 year period where there's a lot of shaking out of who's going to be in charge. Anselm was very much on the idea that there should be independence on church matters against the state. The battle lines were drawn with the Carolingians, that empire there in France right there, and the new English monarchs were fighting to try to control England. Independence of the spiritual power for the temporal was the aim, and this was mostly directed, once again, against King William II, or Rufus of England, right? We have that fight once again. In 1103, he was exiled from his bishopric, Anselm, and he would be received back in 1106, when Henry recounted right to confer the ecclesial offices and return taxes and land. So we end up getting the church's land and money back. So this becomes the sort of big push. And so Anselm is involved in many of these civil authority fights for the church, as well as his philosophy and other areas of life. Anselm wrote quite a bit, not nearly as much as we would talk about people like Aquinas or Augustine, but the topics of which Anselm will write extend quite a bit. And we're going to get notions of rhetoric and notions of free will and truth, and really kind of a development in Western philosophy after Augustine, especially in certain notions of original sin becomes a little bit more mandate and moving forward. This original sin controversy, again, we almost take it for granted now in the West that this is what, is believed by Christians in the West. But in the East, Christians don't hold the notions of original sin, as we mentioned. This is very much an Augustinian notion. So Anselm becomes really the advancer of this notion and doctrine of original sin. And he's important enough as an interpreter of Augustine that this becomes pretty much normative moving forward here. He also contributed very strongly on the notions of the will. The idea was that original sin is the perversion of the will, and it directs the will of man away from God and the good. In doing so, it limits man's freedom and makes man a servant of sin. It produces this deprivation of grace and the loss associated with this deprivation of grace. It is original to Adam, and then it's original to all after that. The consequence is also due everyone, even if you are an infant, and that is just that sin is passed from one to another. And so there's this interesting notion of having free will, and this will is yet also perverted or twisted towards sin due to notions of original sin and how that is going to go through. So we have this sort of twist in aim of what this is. Again, you can kind of think about this and answer yourself thoughts of, can we have notions of free will if our will is already inclined towards sin? For Anselm, that is, he addresses this in many different works, but we'd also need to see the value of the sacraments, as Augustine also advanced, right? That the church becomes a sacramental agent, a dispenser of grace, and that the sacrament of baptism, for instance, eliminates this notion and bondage of original sin, and therefore would be what really gives you free will. But it's only through the grace of the church and the sacraments, etc. So we can add this as an extra layer of this discussion and the importance of the sacrament. Anselm is often identified as the father of scholasticism, in part because of his contribution of dialectic. And while mentioned earlier that dialectic had existed before, right? We have early examples of this kind of with Socrates and his sort of teaching. We have a different sort of argument and argumentation and style of that developing with Anselm. Now again, we have dialectic in kind of that Anselmian, non-Socratic sort of way existing in the East, and we also have it existing before the time of Anselm with one of his teachers, Lanfranc. But Anselm gets the credit, rightly or wrongly. Same sort of thing as when we get to people like we talked about with Aquinas, kind of gets the credit for reintroducing or mastering or fully synthesizing Aristotle into a scholastic system, this medieval school of thought that Anselm is given the title of the father of, sort of thing. Even though this isn't entirely the case for Aquinas either, right? Aquinas' teacher, Albert, did more work on introducing Aquinas, or introducing Aristotle than Aquinas ever did. And we also have, Aristotle being used by Bonaventure and others. But Aquinas is seen as the master of it and kind of given that sort of hallmark, that title, that sort of recognition. In the same sort of way, even though Lanfranc taught the idea of dialectic to Anselm reintroducing it, gets that sort of title, right? Also, it's important to understand that scholasticism during the time of Anselm is very Platonic. There's this sort of Platonic realism that implies a real thing behind ideas, right? That there's this idea and therefore, or this realm that exists within all of this, and that this becomes part of this discussion. We are not really engaging at the time of Anselm with people like Aristotle. It's very much following the works and contributions of Augustine, and Augustine is the chief shaper of philosophy for Anselm. There's also very little concern for metaphysics or epistemology in his work, and he tries to just follow notions of pure reason, and this is how we should dictate and understand his notions of reality and his philosophy. So very much in this whole what is real and what is reasonable, and it's very much kind of following both Augustine and Plato. Anselm is this pivotal figure, and we know him, but we don't know him just because he's the father of Scholasticism or his notions of free will and original sin. While these are important, other people also say his interpretation of the atonement becomes very important in shaping, again, Catholic theology in the West, and it is true, and it very much impacts even Protestant theology in their understanding. But he's known initially in philosophy classes because of his ontological argument. Ontological means pertaining to the nature of being, and this is his argument. This is his understanding. It's something that pertains to the nature of being. In other words, the nature of things reveals what it is. And so again, when I use the word tree, I say tree, you all have this image of a tree in your mind. They're all going to be different, right? No two of you will probably have the same tree in mind unless you're both staring at it at the same time or happen to look at the same thing, right? But you have this image in there because it has this tree-ness. The nature of a tree is that it has tree-ness. A bush is not a tree because it doesn't have enough treeness. Neither likely does a wooden desk. But again, metal Christmas trees might. Again, has this notion of treeness. What the ontological argument is for Anselm is in relation to God, not just to trees. The argument that Anselm has is that God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? The nature of being, the nature of who God is that God is greater than anything you can conceive of or think about. This is the greatness of God. Now, this is often identified as a proof for the existence of God, and people like or don't like ontological or cosmological arguments for the existence of God. It all varies and looks different depending on who you are. But we should understand that Anselm didn't start this as I'm going to go prove everyone that God exists. Look at my argument. We'll address the merits of this here in a second. It was originally a prayer and meditation used by the monk on one of the Psalms, right? This is the point of it. It was not trying to convince somebody who doesn't believe to believe. In fact, he even starts off with this idea that nor do I seek to understand that I can believe, but rather I believe so that way I can understand. For I believe this too, that unless I believe, I shall not understand. Right? That there is this idea that faith precedes knowledge, and this becomes very important for how Anselm sees and constructs the world. But this is why we know him. So we'll spend some time going over this argument and what it means and its nuances there as well. This is the classic ontological argument, the one that he uses. It becomes so normative in understanding, but it's good to kind of break it down and look at it. He starts off, about the third paragraph that you guys had to read. Nor do I seek to understand that I can believe, but rather I believe so that I can understand. For I believe this too, that unless I believe, I shall not understand. Right? The idea here is that faith precedes knowledge. This is not I'm going to hit you over the head and therefore you have to believe my argument for the existence of God. But it's I will understand the nature of who God is, and then I can kind of understand a little bit about God's nature. Right? That this, again, pertaining to the nature of being idea for ontological arguments. Chapter 2, he continues, Therefore, Lord, you who give knowledge of the faith, give me as much knowledge as you know to be fitting for me. Right? Again, God is the one who's granting this. He's already starting from the idea that God exists. And indeed, we believe you are something greater than which cannot be thought. Or is there no such kind of thing? For the fool said in his heart that there is no God. Psalm 13:1 and 52:1. But certainly that same fool, having heard what I just said, something greater than which cannot be thought, understands what he heard, and what he understands is in his thought, even if he does not think it exists. For it is one thing for something to exist in a person's thought, and quite another for the person to think that it exists. Right? So he starts off with this idea that when I say God is than that which nothing greater can be conceived, regardless of who you are, you have an image in your mind of than that which nothing greater can be conceived. It exists at least in your thought. This idea of greater than what you can think about. Right? You all have this image. Now, it might not all be the same, but you all would start to, if you had to articulate it, start to add in notions of goodness, kindness, love, empathy, power. All of these sorts of ideas would be onto the greatest of what something would be. And you all will probably grow and mature, and this list would be larger and larger, but you can think of the greatest good, the greatest power, the greatest knowledge, and have this all in there. And therefore, in your mind right now, you all, regardless if you believe in God or not, have an image of that which nothing greater can be conceived. But it is still very tricky that there are things that exist in reality and there are things that exist in the mind, right? We kind of have these sort of concentric circles of how things can be. There are those things that cannot exist either in the mind or reality. There are logical contradictions, etc., and that falls outside of the realm of thought. There are those ideas that exist in your mind. There are those ideas that can exist in reality, even if they don't. And there are those things that exist in reality. And to follow after people like Descartes, who we've discussed, right? You know that you exist because you're a thinking thing. You're a thing which thinks. And therefore you know you exist in reality. Anselm is kind of playing in that same sort of sandbox that Descartes does later. Right? So some things we know exist in the mind, but not reality. We have conceptions of time travel. Right? As far as everyone knows, this might not be something that could ever exist. It's great science fiction, but it's still fiction. We all know about it. We can all think of movies and stories of time travel, time machines, etc., and even have fantasies for this. But none of you have done it. None of you can do it. You don't know anyone who's done it. You won't, right? It's something that exists in the mind, but not really in reality. There are other things that can exist in reality, but likely they don't, right? We have things like pink elephants. There are elephants, and there's dye, so we could make a pink elephant. But generally speaking, it's not a common part of reality. And we're not expecting to encounter all of this. Or if we do, we would think, oh my goodness sakes, what did somebody do? They dyed this poor elephant, right? And there's a problem. There are other things like penguins, right? Those just clearly do exist in reality. There's different types, different sizes, different habits. There's lots of movies about them. Sometimes they dance, sometimes they march, right? But we know, regardless of fictionalized accounts of these things, that penguins exist in reality. That there's a big difference between a penguin and time travel. And we'd probably put pink elephants and that sort of idea in that realm as well. But we know that there's some things that just cannot exist really in the mind or in reality, right? Where do you put an unthinkable thought? An unthinkable thought cannot exist in the mind or reality because it's, a logical contradiction, a square circle or a circled square. Pick your option, right? They're either of them. They're logical contradictions. Then you kind of think about, what do you do? Where do you put different stuff? Like, Where do you put ideas of a prime number that's greater than 2? Right? You know where this is, but is this just in the mind, or are you going to put this in reality? Where do you put notions of the self? Talking dogs. You know, Star Wars characters, for those of you who like that. A single-sided coin. Irresistible force meeting an unmovable object. A fountain, right? These are all great questions for you to think about. Where do you put them? And you can kind of probably think of other examples and where you might want to put them. In fact, you might want to discuss this with one another on where do you put these sorts of ideas. The big one for us and for Anselm is where do we put God? Right? We know from what Anselm's ontological argument is at the very beginning, if nothing else, God is not in that outside category. God is not in the cannot exist in the mind or reality. Because when I said and defined God, right, pertaining to that nature of being notion of ontological, that God is than that which nothing greater can be conceived, you all conceived of a being than that which nothing greater can be conceived. It's not the same thing as an unthinkable thought, because you all have notions of the greatest as opposed to just infinite. That becomes more challenging. Again, logically, how you're going to look at that and shape that and identify it. So God at least exists in the mind. Now the question is do we move God into that inner circle and to that smallest circle, right, that exists in reality as well? And this becomes, again, the idea of the argument for Anselm. This is how we have to ponder things. Anselm advances this. Thus, even the fool is compelled to grant that something greater than which cannot be thought exists in thought, as we just mentioned, because he understands what he hears, and whatever is understood exists in thought. And certainly, than that which greater nothing can be conceived of exists only in thought, cannot exist only in thought. For if it exists only in thought, it could also be thought of as existing in reality as well. Right? So, very simply, which one is greater? If therefore, then that which nothing greater can be thought exists in thought alone, then that which nothing greater can be thought turns out not to be than that which greater cannot actually be thought, and that is obviously logically impossible. Therefore, something than that which greater cannot be thought undoubtedly exists both in thought and in reality. Because it's greater to exist in reality than just in thought, if God is indeed then that which nothing greater can be conceived of, or nothing greater that can be thought, then God must exist not just in your thought as you think, but it must be an existent thing, because that would indeed be greater. Now, you might disagree with Anselm on this point. You might say that a perceived thought might be greater than a reality, but you'd have to make that argument as well and kind of be able to say, this is where I would disagree with you on Anselm. But Anselm points out that, right, generally speaking, most of us are going to understand and agree that then that which nothing greater can be conceived exists in reality, because existing in reality is greater than not existing in reality. Chapter 3, he continues, in fact, it so undoubtedly exists that it cannot be thought of as not existing. Right now, he's really pushing his advantage here, right? For one can think that there exists something that cannot be thought of as not existing, and that would be greater than something which can be thought of as not existing. For if that then which nothing greater can be thought of as not existing, then the greater that which cannot be thought of as not as greater would not be than which nothing can be greater can be thought, which doesn't make sense. If you could think of then that which greater than could be thought of not existing, then indeed it's not that then that which nothing greater can be thought. Therefore, not only does it have to exist in reality as much as in your mind, but in your mind, when you're conceiving of it, you perceive of it and understand of it as existing in reality and not existing, because not existing is therefore not than that which greater nothing could be conceived. Just following? I know it's a little bit of a tongue twister and a little bit hard to kind of move on, but you're all following the track, even though it might seem a little bumpy or jarred in one moment, right? And you, O Lord, he continues, are this being. You exist so undoubtedly, my Lord God, that you cannot be even thought of as not existing. And deservedly, for if some mild mind could think of something greater than you, that creature would rise above the Creator and could pass judgment on the Creator, which is, of course, absurd. And indeed, whatever exists except you alone can be thought of as not existing. Right? God exists so much that you can't conceive of God not existing, but I can conceive of all of you not existing, and you can conceive of me as not existing. In fact, probably most of your life, you're not really conceiving the existence of others and really thinking about it and weighing on it. And you can easily think of a time when they were not and will not. But God, you cannot. Therefore, God exists more than you exist, and your neighbors exist. God's reality is beyond your reality because you didn't exist not that long ago. And you won't exist, at least as we understand certain notions of existence, especially if we're going to deny a notion of God, before too much longer. Right? Life is but a blip, and that is where it is. So God alone, Anselm says, you alone of all things must truly exist, and thus enjoy existence to the fullest degree of all things, because nothing else exists so undoubtedly, and thus everything else enjoys being in a lesser degree. Chapter 4, he says, for God is than that which nothing greater can be conceived. Whoever understands this also understands that God exists in such a way that one cannot even think of him as not existing. And indeed, whatever exists except God alone can be thought of as not existing. For God is than that which nothing greater can be conceived. Right? There is this very clear answer to it. And largely, Anselm's argument kind of works in a lot of ways. It's hard to kind of find the tack to where is it wrong in this way, that way, or the other. You might disagree with the conclusion, but the argument is circular enough that it kind of feeds into itself. But wait, there's Kant. Kant and his critiques of the ontological argument are pretty strong and important, and we'll see this in his works where he denies the possibility of an ontological proof of the existence of God. Now again, Kant doesn't deny that God exists, but he doesn't like ontological arguments. Kant says, it is evident from what has been said that the conception of an absolutely necessary being is a mere idea, the objective reality of which is far from being established by the mere fact that it is a need of reason. On the contrary, this idea serves merely to indicate a certain unattainable perfection, and rather limits the operations then by the presentation of new objects. It extends into the sphere of the understanding. Right? Kant is pointing out a critique here that it only indicates that if you accept a proposition, then the proposition is true, but it doesn't establish that the proposition needs to be accepted. Now, here, before we even get on any bit farther, we have a very important difference in perspective between Kant and Anselm. Kant kind of comes much, much later, has the benefit of reading critiques, etc., and new forms of philosophy and a different worldview. Not a worldview that doesn't necessarily have God or anything else in it, but Anselm is very much in this Platonic frame of mind, where we have the sphere of ideas and the sphere of reality. And therefore, reality points to the realm of ideas, and if it exists in this realm of ideas, that is in many ways more manifest and more real than the material world around us. Kant doesn't subscribe to all of those ideas, that there is realms of ideas and there is the real world and how this works is a little more squishy. And we'll get to that when we talk about Kant later on. But this becomes part of that discussion moving forward. And why they can look at the same idea and come up with different conclusions, it's because they see the world differently. Essentially, we can again look at another pivotal character of both Aquinas and even Descartes and even Hume before we get to Kant that changes the perspective on how we would address this basic logical argument. Kant states that triangles don't necessarily exist. Right? Every geometrical proposition, a triangle has three sides, it is said is absolutely necessary. And thus people talked of an object which lay out a sphere of our understanding as if it were perfectly plain with a conception of such a being meant. All the examples adduced have been drawn without exception from judgments and not from things. But the unconditioned necessity of a judgment does not form the absolute necessity of a thing. On the contrary, the absolute necessity of a judgment is only conditioned necessity of a thing or of the predicate in a judgment. Right? In other words, when we think about something, all it says that is if this is true, that this is the case, or that it would be a consequence if indeed something exists that would hold these sort of qualities. The proposition above mentioned does not announce that three angles necessarily exist, but upon the condition that a triangle exists, three angles must necessarily exist in it. And thus the logical necessity has been the source of the greatest delusions. Right? This becomes the sort of argument that Kant is making. That if you start from the proposition that indeed God exists, then yes, God, if it's part of God's nature of being then that which nothing greater can be conceived, would be indeed then that which nothing greater could be conceived. Again, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it exists. As Kant says, three angles don't necessarily exist, but if a triangle exists, because the nature of its being is such that a triangle has three angles, then three angles necessarily do exist. And this is the mode and the argument within all of that. So what are your thoughts on Anselm and his ontological argument? Is it good, bad, ugly? It's probably not ugly. It's either probably good or bad. You either like it or you don't. Or you like Kant and his critique and you think that that works well. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you say, well, you know, Kant, you've got a great idea, but your worldview is a little different. It's a little off. It's hard in some ways. It's also kind of not terribly hard. Right? It's kind of wordy. For God is then that which nothing greater can be conceived. Isn't, you know, the easiest thing to say repeatedly over and over again, especially when we're saying that it's not and it is and it is and it's not, etc. Right? But does it work? Can you say that God is a being, than that which nothing greater can be conceived, and use this as a proof? Does it change, or is it just really a great meditation on the nature and quality of God and not such a great proof? These are all good thoughts to think about and to discuss with another. And why, if you think it does work, do you think it works? And if it doesn't, why not? If you have any questions, let me know.